Welcome to Down in the Bumps, a perinatal mental health podcast that shares stories of women and families who have experienced perinatal mental health problems. My name is Laura. I'm your host and I'm a doctor training in psychiatry. At the end of each episode, I'll share some learning about perinatal mental health related to the story we've heard. Please note that what is discussed in the podcast should not be taken as medical advice, and you should discuss your own medical care with your GP. In this episode, we'll hear Verity's story. Verity reflects on the struggles she has experienced as an autistic person becoming a new mum and navigating mental health services. She also tells me about the strengths of autistic mums. Through our conversation, Verity taught me a lot. She is an expert by experience on autism and also by virtue of the work that she does. I'm therefore not going to end this episode with some information about autism. I think it's right that we're informed by autistic people themselves. There is mention of suicide, so if this may be triggering for you, perhaps step away and join us another time. Verity, thank you for coming to speak to me today. I'm really excited to hear what you're going to tell us. So first of all, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and about your family?
Yes, so I am 39 and I am married to my husband and I have a little girl who's called Grace and she has just turned 4.
And can you tell me a bit about your work and your research?
So my main day job is working in clinical research at the University of Oxford, where I work on a trial involving a child population. I also do a lot of patient involvement work. So I work with NHSE on their perinatal co-production group, and I work with the Royal College of Psychiatrists on their perinatal quality network, where I go around and visit services and help to review them, and also on the Royal College's new National Autism Training Programme for psychiatrists. And I'm also doing some work with a local organisation called Autism Oxford, and we deliver training on autism to community perinatal mental health teams. So I've ended up kind of combining my work and my other side interests into a PhD, and I'm looking specifically at autistic women's experiences of accessing community perinatal mental health teams, and it builds on the back of a much bigger project called the ESME2 project, which looks at community perinatal mental health teams and how they function and the sort of services that they are able to deliver to mothers. So it's really exciting. At the moment I'm doing a systematic review, which is a type of literature review about just the general experiences of autistic women during the perinatal period.
That sounds really interesting. I look forward to reading that. So today, Verity, we're mostly going to talk about when you became unwell during your pregnancy. Was that your first episode of mental illness?
So I've got a long history of mental illness tracking back to my early teens, and that looked like depression, and it looked like anorexia twice, and it looked like more depression. As you know, I've since been diagnosed with autism, and that happened while I was under community perinatal mental health services. And if I look back now at my experiences kind of since my early teens, I can see that a lot of the mental health problems related directly to being autistic.
I know you've said to me before, Verity, that you've noticed that transitions were particularly hard for you. Can you tell me a bit about that?
I think transitions, have always been hard. And I think my first episode of anorexia around the time that I left school and went up to university, I think that was quite a big key transition. And you could see that I just really wasn't coping. And that was why I developed anorexia the first time. And I think transitions are a big thing around the perinatal period, aren't they? Because you have the transition to becoming pregnant, and then you have the transition to having a baby, and then transition to life after having a baby. And I think that was quite difficult for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, new role of becoming a mum. Yeah. So Verity, tell me a bit about your experience of pregnancy.
I'd wanted to have a baby for quite a long time, but because of my previous history of poor mental health, I always thought that it was something that I just couldn't do because I didn't think it would be fair on a child. But then I had quite a long period of stability soon after I moved into working into clinical research. And then we decided to try for a baby. It took a little while to get pregnant, about 8 months. So I was very pleased when we finally got the positive test result. But quite quickly, I noticed that my mental health started to deteriorate, and it was mostly around not sleeping, and I think that was something kind of hormonal related. But my mood quickly becomes quite low if I don't sleep, and so yeah, that happened very early on in the pregnancy. My husband was also made redundant 11 days after I found out that I was pregnant, and that was also quite a tricky time of transition because in my head, I'd had how it would all work with him in a job that was mostly working from home. Mm-hmm. And then obviously he managed to get another job very quickly, but it was quite a kind of disruptive thing at that point in pregnancy.
Yeah. It sounds like pregnancy was difficult. It wasn't what you planned. Your husband was made redundant. How did things progress from there?
So I really needed some mental health support quite early on, but it just didn't exist. And the midwife just wasn't really very able to be very helpful. She did her best, but obviously it wasn't really her area of expertise. And I kind of got a little bit better, and then I got worse. And then when I was about 22 weeks pregnant, I had a really big breakdown. And I was about as unwell as I'd ever been with my mental health at that point. It was really tricky because I'd never heard of antenatal depression before. I was fully aware of postnatal depression. My mother had it, and I was kind of almost expecting to get that, and I was prepared to get that, but I wasn't expecting something to happen when I still had all this time to go. I had like all these plans. I had a holiday booked, and I had master's modules to complete. So anyway, I had a big breakdown, and nobody quite knew what to do. But then the midwife spoke to the obstetric psychiatrist, and it turned out that brand new community perinatal mental health team had literally just opened the week before in my area, and so I was referred to them, and they came out and saw me on Christmas Eve, and then they said that they were going to give me help and support throughout the rest of my pregnancy, and then potentially moving forwards after that. So yeah, they were really kind, and it was start of really quite a long journey.
Okay. And then as things got closer, as time got closer to the birth, how was your mental health then, and what were your thoughts about planning for the birth?
My mental health improved from a kind of rock bottom place, but it didn't ever really get back to a very good place. I was very anxious about giving birth for two reasons, really. I was really anxious about the amount of pain that I was going to be in. I was really, really frightened about that. Mm-hmm. And I was also anxious, and now we can look back at this with a kind of autism lens on. I was very anxious about the unpredictability of it, because a baby just comes when the baby wants to come. Yeah. And you can't really plan for it. So I had wondered if I could have a C-section, but the trust where I gave birth at that time didn't do maternal request C-sections. And I thought that would be quite good because you could turn up on the day and you'd know when you were going to have your baby, but that wasn't possible. So I was getting very anxious towards the end of pregnancy, and I was just anxious about whether I was feeling the right amount of movements and whether I was doing all the right things for my baby, and just increasingly anxious about the birth. So the consultant at the hospital booked me in for an induction at 40 weeks plus 2 days. And yeah, that was it. That was when I was expecting to deliver my baby. But of course, as you know, from when I talked to you previously, things don't work like that. And I came home from a hospital appointment, about to have my tea, and my waters broke. And that was like 9 days before the induction was supposed to happen. And I remember ringing up the maternity assessment unit. I was saying, but I'm not supposed to be having a baby right now. I'm supposed to be having a baby in 9 days' time. I think they must have thought I was a bit strange for saying that. So I had to go in that evening. So I went into the hospital, and at that point, labour hadn't started. So they either offered me an induction or to go home and wait. I was just like, give me the induction, let's get on with it. But unfortunately, it was a full moon, and the delivery suite was full, so I wasn't able to have my induction as planned. So they sent me upstairs to the antenatal ward to wait until there was room free to go and start that. So one of the things that the perinatal team had done beforehand was that they'd arranged for my husband to be able to stay with me at all times in hospital. So that was really good. They found us a side room on the antenatal ward with a pull-out bed for him. And so we were able to wait there.
Good.
So then after that, labour actually started spontaneously pretty quickly, and it started to get quite painful pretty quickly, which I guess, I don't know if that took me by surprise or not. It was honestly the most painful experience of my life, and I was absolutely desperate for an epidural, which was what had been care planned for me by the perinatal team, but there still wasn't space on the delivery suite, so they couldn't take me down and get me the epidural. And they tried offering me gas and air, but autistic people often experience sensory difficulties, and for me that really kind of gave me some very strange sensory sensations, so I wasn't able to tolerate the gas and air. So it was really painful. Things picked up about 7 a.m. in the morning when I finally got taken down to the delivery suite. No one had explained to me that once you get to the delivery suite you still have to be monitored for half an hour before you get your epidural, but to give the midwife credit, she immediately got me put on the monitoring equipment, and then she got the anaesthetist lined up so that the anaesthetist was pretty much waiting outside the room to come in and give me the epidural. And honestly, my experience was transformed after that. I felt a lot more in control of the situation. And I know from my research that autistic people often experience pain differently from neurotypical people. So they might experience pain worse than a neurotypical person, which is clearly what I was experiencing, or they might not really feel pain at all. And there's another thread in the literature about how autistic people's expressions don't always reflect how someone's feeling. So it's possible that I didn't look like I was in pain and that the midwives weren't properly recognising that. But anyway, as I say, I got my epidural, and then about an hour and a half later, Grace was born. So it was all worth it in the end, but I definitely wouldn't go through giving birth ever again.
No. Well, I'm glad that things picked up after you got the epidural, and that's really interesting what you were saying there about your perception of pain and autistic people's sensory sensitivities as well. How was your mental health after Grace was born?
So actually it was all right. So I was still getting support from the community perinatal mental health team, and the nursery nurse did a lot of work with me on helping me to understand a baby and how to look after a baby. I did feel that it didn't really come naturally to me, but she gave me so much good advice and showed me what to do basically, and helped me to get out and about. And yeah, it was the summer. It was lovely. I was out walking with the pram every day. Seemed to have loads of really good weather. And yeah, my mental health was really good. So one of the things that's very important to me is exercise. And we now know since my autism diagnosis that I've got a sensory profile that likes lots of big motor movements. So things like walking, running, swimming are all things that are helpful to me. So I was able to get back to exercise pretty quickly after giving birth. And I think that was one of the things that was good about not having had a C-section, actually, was that I was able to get back to exercising a lot more quickly. I was walking 10,000 steps within a couple of days. And then at 4 weeks, the GP let me go back to the swimming pool because I was quite frustrated with not being able to swim. I think that really did help my mental health in the early days. So yeah, everything was going fine. But then it got to the end of the summer and my mental health really started deteriorating. I can't really put my finger on what was happening. Maybe if I'd gone back to work at that stage, that would have been helpful. I was quite isolated because I wasn't going to work or really seeing my friends. And I just was very aware of this history of mental illness. And I was just very conscious that it was probably going to come back since I'd had antenatal depression. And I was just very conscious of the effect that it would have on my daughter. And I was just really worried about that. And that kind of led into quite a downward spiral.
Yeah, really, really understandable thoughts given what you'd experienced before. But where did that downward spiral lead?
So during the October, I got more and more unwell. My thoughts were getting worse and worse. And then there was this quite big turning point. So up until that point, I'd been the only person that could settle Grace to sleep at night. She always needed me to get her off to sleep. But then that week, my husband did it for the first time. And I was just like, right, okay, he can do it. They don't need me anymore. They'd been much better off without me. We'd just started weaning and I'd filled an entire freezer with little cubes of food. So I was just like, well, they can cope on their own. They'll be absolutely fine. So perinatal ended up seeing me quite urgently on the Friday. And it was the first time that I'd met the psychiatrist. She was really kind. And one of the things I'll always remember about that is that I really didn't want to engage with anybody that day. And I was just sat wearing my dressing gown, which is very uncharacteristic for me. I was sat on the floor pretending to play with my daughter. And whilst my care coordinator sat on the sofa, the psychiatrist came down and sat on the floor with me. And I just thought that was amazing, kind of being with me where I was at that point. Absolutely. So we had a bit of a discussion about things, and they agreed to put me in touch with the crisis team over the weekend based on a few conditions, but I wasn't able to meet those conditions. And then followed a very difficult, challenging day. The crisis team didn't really make things better. I was very, very distressed. So they initially threatened me with the police. At that point, I was on my own in the house with Grace. The crisis team obviously got stressed. Then they sent 2 people out to see me. And then the next thing I knew was that I had a phone call saying that there were 2 doctors and a social worker coming around to see me. And I'm not stupid. I knew that was a mental health act assessment. But I was quite cross about that because at that point, they'd not offered me a hospital admission. They'd not even told me that the mental health act assessment was going to happen. So eventually, about 7 o'clock at night, these 3 people came round. And we did have a sensible conversation. I was clear that I would go into hospital if that was the only option. I didn't really want to be sectioned into hospital. I was very scared about the restrictions on my freedom if I were to be sectioned into hospital, and like whether I'd be able to carry out my normal routines and whether I'd be stuck there for a very long time. So I agreed to go into hospital. But unfortunately, because things have been messed around so much, I couldn't go straight to a mother and baby unit that night. I had to go into an acute ward. And that was really quite a desperate situation because I thought that if I was going to be alive, then I needed to be there to look after Grace. And there I was, that I was alive and I was separated from my baby. And that was really quite distressing. And then the next day, I had to be transferred by ambulance to the mother and baby unit, but they wouldn't let me go with my husband and my daughter. I had to go in an ambulance and they had to follow down the road. So again, that was really, really distressing. I have to say the ambulance people were so kind. Honestly, they let me charge my phone, which I'd not been allowed to do in the hospital. And they even made me a cup of tea out of their thermos. I wish I knew who those 2 people were. They were amazing. And sometimes I think that's the thing, isn't it? You encounter really kind professionals and that does make things a bit easier.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you had that experience though. But pleased that you did meet some kind professionals, but it just really sad circumstances. How was that admission to the mother and baby unit? Was it what you feared?
It was very challenging. I did really struggle with not being able to do my usual routines. So usually I go swimming first thing in the morning, and during my maternity leave, I was getting up very early to go swimming and then coming back before my husband went to work. And that was quite difficult for me. I did do a lot of walking. And the place where I went was very hilly and I actually broke the pram because I walked up and down so many hills. There were other things which were difficult about it. So it was quite a large mother and baby unit. There were a lot of women and a lot of babies on there. So that was quite noisy and it felt like it was quite chaotic. And obviously with that many women, you need quite a lot of staff to look after them. And the staff shifts changed 3 times a day. So there was constantly new people who you were needing to talk to or who were needing to talk to you. And I found that quite overwhelming. And then there's all the difficulties around food. So I have quite a restricted diet and that relates back to autism and difficulties with taste and so on. And one of the things I think a lot of women get out of an admission like that is the peer support. But because of my autism, I struggle a lot with social interactions. So I didn't really talk to any of the other mothers whilst I was on the ward. So I didn't get kind of that benefit from it either. There were some benefits. So I did some video interaction guidance therapy with a psychologist, which I found quite helpful.
What's that, Verity? I'm just conscious that people listening might not know what that is.
So video interaction guidance is where you meet with a psychologist and you set out kind of, I guess, beliefs that you might want to challenge about yourself. And so my constant belief that I still have, despite lots of therapy and so on, is that I'm a terrible person, and specifically to that situation, that I'm a terrible mother. So what we had to do was film a little extract of me interacting with Grace, and then the psychologist would choose a little bit of it to illustrate, I guess, an opposing argument to that belief that I was a terrible mother. It was interesting actually, because I thought I had to perform for the camera. So no one had properly explained to me about it. So I rehearsed in my head what I was going to do, which was to sing a nursery rhyme in German to Grace, because we'd been listening to a lot of German nursery rhymes on Spotify during the year. I've got a GCSE in it. I don't really speak it, but it was just something nice to do whilst on maternity leave, you know, a bit different. So here I was singing this nursery rhyme in German to Grace, putting on a great performance to it. And I just didn't see how that was going to be helpful, a video of me singing a nursery rhyme in German to Grace. But when we watched it back, it turns out that psychologist wasn't that interested in me singing a German nursery rhyme to Grace. She was interested in the bit where Grace had been distracted from my singing by the light on the camera that she was using to film me. And so Grace had looked at the camera and I'd commented on that, and we'd had a little interaction about that. And that was the little segment that she showed me back. And it was quite powerful because she said, well, that's kind of what's important, isn't it? You're following her lead and you're responding to her, and it shows that you've got a good bond. So that was quite useful. And obviously while I was there, I also started on some medication, which I'd been taking previously, which was hope that it was going to work. Yeah, there were helpful bits. And the nursery nurses were really good in terms of organising different activities to do with the babies. And I quite liked that. It was nice to have a few activities to break up the day.
And then after you were discharged, you were really struggling. Did things start to feel better? And when did things start to feel better, do you think?
So I think there was quite a key turning point for me. So my care coordinator came to see me on a Friday. I think it was in early December. And I was really unwell, and she really wanted to send me back to the hospital. But she was a very clever lady. And I'd nominated the nursery nurse for the Mental Health Trust's Improving Patient Experience Award, and it had turned out that she'd been shortlisted for this big prize, and the ceremony was going to be the following Tuesday. So my care coordinator said to me very firmly, she said, you mustn't do anything before Tuesday, because otherwise the nursery nurse won't be able to enjoy the ceremony because she'll be too upset. And she was right about that. I agreed with her, and that did kind of stave things off over the weekend. And then on the Tuesday evening, I found out that my nursery nurse had won that award. And that created, it made me just feel a bit better. It made me feel that I was able to do something for someone else and give something back. And it just made me feel like a bit more of a person again. I had something to contribute to the world. So that was actually a real turning point. I know that's probably quite unusual as a turning point, but it was a turning point for me. And I was still pretty unwell, but I was better than I was. And I ended up going back to work in the middle of the January on a phased return. And that was really tricky. I wasn't quite well enough to be back at work, but at the same time, that was what my plan was. And I didn't really want to change my plan.
Now, unfortunately, I do know that you admitted to hospital again when Grace was 10 months old. Yeah. What do you think was the trigger to the deterioration in your mental health then?
So, firstly, I'd never clearly got fully better since the episodes of the previous autumn. So I went back to work, and my husband took a month off of shared parental leave. And since I'd come out of hospital, we'd been putting Grace into nursery for 2 afternoons a week. But unfortunately, during that month that my husband had off with her, Grace was repeatedly unwell. It's what children do when they start nursery for the first time. They come into contact with lots of bugs. They've not got a very good immune system. So, then Cam went back to work, and Grace carried on being poorly throughout February. And it just felt like we were constantly juggling her having to stay at home and not really sleeping, because when a baby's unwell, they need a lot of comfort. And what ultimately led to that second hospital admission was that we'd had all of this, and then Grace got hand, foot and mouth disease. She was just really poorly, and I hadn't slept for a couple of nights. I just lost the plot. I was just thinking again that I'm a terrible mother. I can't do this. I'm a terrible mother because I can't do this. And I just don't want to exist anymore, because it's just all too hard. I just can't cope with it. And it's interesting now looking back at that through the autism lens, because there were clearly so many triggers there that related to autism rather than to anything else. So with autism, it's, for me, I have a clear desire, as I said, for predictability, knowing what's going to happen. I have a strong desire, as I think I've expressed, for routines. Again, that links to knowing what's going to happen. And when you have a sick child, all of that gets thrown off. And then you get kind of sensory overwhelm from a child that needs to be held a lot, and a child that's crying a lot because they're feeling sad. And then compounded by kind of lack of sleep. It was, and the stress of being back at work. It was kind of obvious that something was not going to go well after that. So I got admitted to an acute ward. Grace, they said, was too big at 10 months to go to the mother and baby unit again. And I did have quite a short admission there. It was just for 4 nights. That was enough to give me a bit of a chance to reset. And I came out expecting to have lots of support from the community perinatal mental health team. But unfortunately, 2 weeks later, we were in the first COVID lockdown. And so kind of overnight, all my face-to-face support vanished, which was a bit tricky.
Yeah, sounds a bit tricky. Sounds very tricky. Obviously, things suddenly changed. The world suddenly changed. But how was your interaction with the community mental health team at that time then? Because obviously, yeah, as you pointed out, you weren't getting that face-to-face support. And how was telephone calls and MS Teams or Zoom for you?
It was tricky because I had had so much face-to-face contact with them over the last year and a half, and to have that kind of suddenly pulled away from you, it was quite hard. But in some ways, the pandemic played in my favour because obviously Grace was about to turn 1 by that point, and so community perinatal is only commissioned to serve up to 12 months, although in some areas it's now being extended to 24 months. But they said it wouldn't be fair to discharge me in the middle of a pandemic. And I was also waiting at that point for an autism assessment. So they did keep me on, and they ended up keeping me on all the way through until November of that year. So I did get some extra time with them as a result of the pandemic. But it was hard to do appointments on Teams. I mostly did phone calls.
Verity, you were just saying to me before then that you got your diagnosis when you were under the care of the community mental health team. Was it the community perinatal?
Community perinatal, yeah.
Yeah. How did you feel about getting that diagnosis?
I don't really know. It was something that had seemed to be on the cards pretty much since Grace was born. I'd been wondering about it since I read an article in The Guardian the summer before I got pregnant, which was talking about autism in women, and it just seemed to resonate with me. There were a lot of things that I could really identify with. My care coordinator was actually the team manager. She was able to pull some strings and get me an autism assessment. So that happened when Grace was 13 months old. And I had kind of mixed feelings about going into the assessment. I thought they were probably just going to give me an autism diagnosis to make me feel better, and they were probably it was going to be borderline. But when I got the assessment report at that time, autism was diagnosed in terms of levels. So level 1 is kind of needs less support. Level 2 is needs quite a lot of support, and level 3 is needs loads and loads of support. And I was really surprised that I've been diagnosed at level 2, and I was like, so this really is quite clear cut that I'm autistic. Yeah, that was interesting. So then I had some follow-up appointments with an autism specialist nurse, and helping me to kind of learn a little bit more about my condition and different ways of kind of managing it. And I also had the sensory assessment that I referred to earlier, where I completed lots of questionnaires, and we found that I'm very sensory avoiding in a lot of areas. But in terms of kind of touch and kind of the gross motor movement side of things, I'm very sensory seeking, and that, undertaking that kind of sensory profile explains a lot of things, like why I don't really like lots of light bulbs in our light fittings. That's a point of contention between me and my husband. To some extent, my early life protected me from some of these kind of sensory things because I was an only child and I lived in a quiet village, and I went to an independent school, which was, I guess, quite a lot less chaotic than a state secondary school would have been.
Yeah, it's just really interesting to look back on, isn't it? Thinking about how obviously the autism was always there, but it didn't have a name, did it? There was no name to it, and how actually in retrospect you can really understand your experiences. And I do think that the perinatal period is a key point for women who may, up until that point, have been successfully coping with their autism. We talk a lot about masking autism, so where women, particularly, but can be men as well, kind of tend to hide their autism, and they camouflage to try and fit in with everybody else. But I think the wheels can really come off in the perinatal period, because in terms of sensory experiences, firstly having a baby, growing a baby inside of you, feeling those kicking sensations, the sensory difficulties around nausea and pain and so on in pregnancy, then you're kind of giving birth, and a baby is a whole sensory challenge in itself because it wriggles, it needs touching, it cries, makes lots of noise and so on, and that can be really quite tricky. But again, people might have been coping because they've been using things like routines as a coping mechanism, or taking time out as a coping mechanism, and those sorts of things kind of fall away when you're a new mum, because it's very, and
takes a while to get a baby into a routine. And honestly, that's one great thing about autistic mothers. They're great at getting babies into a routine. But I think that's why autism sometimes comes to the fore in the perinatal period. And I think it's really important that clinicians should be looking out for it. So we know that autistic people use mental health care at a higher proportion than neurotypical people. So you'd expect there to be a reasonable number of autistic women presenting in your service who might be diagnosed or who might not be.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming back to your diagnosis of autism, what have you found to be the benefits of having a diagnosis?
It's tricky. That's a hard question because I often feel very negative about being autistic. I feel like it's a big burden that I have to carry around with me. I can see a lot of deficits and deficiencies in me as a result of my autism. Having a diagnosis has been helpful because it's provided some explanations about the way I feel about things, about the way that I experience the world, and a bit of kind of insight into some of my previous difficulties. I think it means that I can plan a bit more to make adaptations and so on. So I know now that planning ahead for things is really important. So we're going on holiday this week. So I've spent a lot of time envisaging how it will work, the different sort of activities that we'll be doing, sort of things that I need to take with me to feel comfortable, like having the right size mug. That makes quite a big difference to me. Making sure that I've got all the food that I want to eat because we won't be anywhere particularly near a supermarket and those sorts of things. So that's quite helpful.
Yeah, in terms of reasonable adjustments, have your workplace been able to help you with that? Or is there anything else when you're sort of going about your life that has made things a bit easier? I know you've mentioned to me before about blue badge parking.
So in terms of work, I work predominantly from home, and that has been really helpful because it enables me to control my sensory environment. So control the temperature, control the lighting, and just not have, I suppose, unnecessary social interactions or unplanned social interactions. I think that's a tricky thing when you're in an office, is that people just talk to you. Whereas my social interactions are generally through scheduled Teams meetings and so on. So that helps me. In terms of other adjustments in my life, one of the things that's been quite helpful is that I've got a blue badge. So I applied after my diagnosis to get disability benefits, personal independence payment from DWP. And the way they grade it is on the difficulties that you have with activities of daily living and getting out and about. And since I was in the mother and baby unit, I've had huge problems in getting out and about. So when they scored back my personal independence payments, I came out with a kind of the top score for difficulties with getting out and about, quite a high score for the activities of daily living. And I find that quite interesting as a side point, because in some ways I probably look quite highly functioning. We don't really like to talk about functioning levels in the autistic community anymore. We prefer to talk about support needs, but I do look quite highly functioning. I have a job. I'm doing a PhD. I've just done a master's. I've got 2 professional fellowships, and I'm doing a lot of patient involvement work. But actually, I have a huge amount of difficulties with everyday life and in kind of organising things, in managing being a parent, as I said, in getting out and about. Even little things like sometimes with managing getting my medication from the pharmacy and things like that, and accessing healthcare and so on, getting to healthcare appointments. That's been something that's been really tricky for me. But anyway, going back to your question about the blue badge, because of that, what the DWP said about my disability benefits, I was eligible to apply for a blue badge. And honestly, that's been really, really helpful to me. I feel quite guilty about having it because I can certainly walk a long way, but in terms of actually getting out and about without the high levels of stress that I was experiencing, being able to park somewhere very close to where I'm going makes a real difference. And actually, it can be the difference between me going somewhere with my daughter or not going somewhere with my daughter. So recently we went to the Natural History Museum and I was able to park right outside. And just because I knew that I would be able to leave easily and quickly if I needed to, that made it a lot more easy.
Good. And I'm really glad that you made that point before about how in some areas of your life you need a lot less support than other areas of your life, because what you might see or what people might see isn't actually sometimes what's going on. So we have touched on some of the things that you found difficult as an autistic person and as an autistic mum. And we know that autism has often been regarded as a deficits-based condition. That's something that you touched on before, which means that the focus has been historically put on things that autistic people find really hard and struggle with. But we know that autistic people have lots of strengths and talents, and it's important that we think about those. Could you tell me a bit more about the strengths of autistic mums?
So I know from my reading that, as I said, autistic mothers can be really good at getting their child into a routine. And I was desperate to get my child into a routine from like day 5 when the nursery nurse visited us for the first time. And she had to kind of let me down gently and explain that it was too early to get the child into a routine. But what she did say was she explained how kind of your child would feed, and then your child would have a bit of playtime, and then your child would sleep. And that was kind of effectively a cycle that would repeat. It might have been the other way around between playing and sleeping. I can't really remember now. But that was kind of helpful for me in knowing what I was going to expect next. And then really very soon, kind of by 6 weeks, we did have a routine, and I knew pretty much when I was going to feed Grace and when she was going to sleep, or when I was going to be trying to get her to sleep. I thought that was quite good. And I think I've still got a very solid routine with Grace. And I think routines are comforting, particularly when you're that age. Know what's going to happen next. And I spend a lot of time on preparing her for things, like talking through what's going to happen. I find that helpful for me. And I'd like to think that's helpful for her as well, in knowing what to expect. So I think autistic mums are also very good at doing research about what's the best thing for their baby. And on the one hand, that can kind of tie people into knots a bit because there's so much information out there. Often people will then ask for help. I think people are very good at trying to get things right for their baby just because they're so interested in finding things out. And often kind of a baby can become a special interest for an autistic mum. I sometimes wonder if Grace is my special interest.
And how is Grace doing now?
She's 4. I often worry about the impact that my having had severe mental illness in her first year will have had on her. But as far as I can tell, I don't think it has had too much of an impact on her. She seems happy and well adjusted. She's got lots of friends at nursery. She's learning to swim and doing really well at that. She's learning to read and again doing really well at that. She's very funny. She makes us laugh. And I've never really been in proximity to a small child before her, so it's just very interesting watching her develop and so on. I just learn so much from her. So she is really a very positive influence on my life.
Oh, amazing. I'm really pleased to hear that. And did she have a nice time at the Natural History Museum?
Yeah, she did. So we have one where we live. It's not the big one in London, but we have one where we live, and there's lots of rocks that you can feel. And I thought she would maybe be interested in kind of dinosaurs and things, which is what children are stereotypically interested in, but she's clearly going to be a geologist because she was just absolutely fascinated by all of the rocks. And I quite enjoyed looking at the rocks too, so that was a nice thing for us. And now I've got a bit more confidence to maybe take her out to somewhere else.
Brilliant. Verity, is there anything you'd like healthcare professionals to know?
I think there's been a few things that I've said over the course of speaking to you today that I would like them to know. I think it's about watching out for autism in the perinatal population, because I think it's a time when it could suddenly come to the fore for somebody who's been successfully masking it or coping with it up until that point. We know that autistic people don't always disclose their diagnosis to a healthcare professional because of the stigma related to it, or the kind of fear that they're going to lose their baby to social services. So clinicians may be working with people who know they're autistic but haven't told them that. And I think the point that you make about autism strengths is really important, and that's something that clinicians should really hold in mind. Particularly in the perinatal period, it's really important to be kind of identifying people's strengths and pointing them out to people, and as part of holding the hope for that person while they're unwell. And this was something my nursery nurse was very good at, and she would always contextualize it. She wouldn't just tell me that I was doing well, she'd tell me that I was doing well and why I was doing well. And sometimes she would even tell me what like doing badly would look like, so that I could properly understand that. So yeah, it's about that, and thinking about how you communicate things.
And is there anything you'd like other autistic mums or families who may be going through similar or have gone through similar to know?
I don't think this is necessarily aimed specifically at autistic mums, but I think at the perinatal mental health population generally, I think it's just about not being hard on yourself about the length of time it can take to get better from something. Allow yourself that time to recover.
Yeah, that's a great message. Thank you so much, Verity, for talking to me today. Honestly, I think I've just learned so much from you from today and the last time we spoke. So all the best with your research and your holiday. Have a lovely time.
Thank you.
If you're looking for any advice, guidance or support, you can go to the National Autistic Society website at www.autism.org.uk.